Peace and love, ladies and gentlemen. This is Brother Garfield from the Brother Garfield podcast. Today we have a special guest. He goes by the name of Jacob. I'm sorry, excuse me, Professor Jacob S. Dorman. He teaches courses on United States history, African American history, the Gilded Age and Progressive Eras, cultural and intellectual history, and core humanities. Dorman received his BA with highest honors from Stanford University in 1996, where he studied with professors including Claiborne Carson, George Fredrickson, Arnold Eisen, and Sylvia Winter, and his PhD in United States history, with an emphasis on African American history from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2004. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Jacob S. Dorman, or I should say, Dr. Jacob S. Dorman. I gotta give you a proper introduction. How are you doing today, sir?
Good. Thank you, Brother Garfield, for having me.
All right. I was introduced to you because I do a lot of, Facebook dialogues and with the Hebrew Israelites. And I also do a lot of debates with the Moorish Science Temple. And it so happens that you did two books. I'm planning to put a book out called Made in America. And your two books are two books I'm going to read sourcing a lot when it comes to Made in America. It's pretty much about different organizations that started here in North America that claims ancient Near East affiliations. All right. But let me ask you this, which somebody have probably never asked before. What made you get into history?
Well, I was really troubled and fascinated by racism. And so I started studying race and racism in all kinds of different disciplines. So I tried anthropology and sociology and political science and cultural studies and history. And I loved kind of how rigorous history is, how much historians have to read to call themselves historians, and how careful and thoughtful good history is. So that's why I chose history.
Okay. All right. So when you ended up getting your PhD and you now teach African American history, do you teach that today where you are, or you used to teach that before?
Yeah, I teach that today. I teach a range of classes. Right now I'm teaching racial and ethnic history, so that's both African American history and history of other groups as well. I thought you were going to ask me the question that I get a lot, which is, why do I teach African American history?
No, I wouldn't ask that, because the source of where it comes from don't matter to me. I think I've grown beyond thinking why you would teach it, but I think out of curiosity, you teaching history is a good thing. My mom was a history teacher. I'm a history buff, so it runs in my family. What made you get into studying the Hebrew Israelites and the Moorish Science Temple?
Okay, good question. So with the Hebrew Israelites, I did research about Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And I was very interested in how he was frequently looking at other groups, whether that was the Irish or the Jews, and their attempts to create a national homeland as a kind of metaphor or as a blueprint even for how African Americans in the hemispheric sense, how Africans in the diaspora could think about building a homeland. And Garvey's movement was sometimes called Black Zionism. So I did that research, and then I did an anthropological course and got an opportunity to go to Israel to do an archaeological dig. And in the course of that, I met some members of the original African Hebrew Israelites of Dimona, and they invited me to come down and visit. So I did that, and I was just really fascinated and transfixed and kind of blown away by that experience, by that community, by the kind of I think what was so powerful about that community is that there was so much love and affirmation in that community. You could tell, and people had a kind of peacefulness about them, and they had a radically different interpretation of world history, not just biblical history. And so I had, at that point, I had studied Jewish history, Ashkenazi Jewish history. I had studied Garvey and nationalism and the Zionist movement, whether that was the Garvey movement or the Jewish Zionist movement. And so studying Black Hebrew Israelites kind of combined a lot of my interests. And then I started doing research on that while I was still an undergraduate. I went to the Schomburg Library, and they were just processing a new collection that was collected by a man who's now a very important rabbi in the city of New York, named Saul Levy. And when Saul Levy was a grad student at Columbia, he started collecting and documenting the different Ethiopian Hebrew congregations that were in the tradition founded by Chief Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthew. So I started doing this research, and the first box that they would let me see was a box called Hatzad Harishon, which means the first step, and it called itself the Civil Rights Movement for the Jews. So I did research in those papers, and I wrote about this organization, which was in the 1960s and 1970s. I can talk more about that if you're interested. But no one had really, at that point, this was the 90s, there was very little about what Black Hebrew Israelism was, what it believed, where it came from, what its sources were, what its tenets were. There was very little published at that point. So when I went to grad school, I went to UCLA, and I started studying Rastafarianism, and I started studying the Hebrew Israelites in greater detail. And I actually wrote my dissertation, not just about the Black Hebrew Israelites, but also about a lot of the religious kind of entrepreneurs who were in Harlem in the 1920s. Many of them called themselves professors of mystic science. And a lot of them were doing root work, healing with roots. And I also just started studying African diaspora religions, including religions like Vodou and Santeria. And so I kind of, over the course of years, became an expert in these alternative religious faiths. I mean, to the degree that anyone from outside these communities can be expert. I availed myself of a lot of archival research. So the dissertation became my first book, which was published 10 years ago in 2013, called Chosen People. And that's about Black Hebrew Israelites. And then that led me to an interest in Black Muslims. And this was also in the context of the fact, I got my PhD in 2004, and we were in the middle of the Iran and Afghanistan wars. And there was a tremendous amount of Islamophobia. And what I was able to document was that America had a very different kind of opinion and attitude towards Islam, especially 100 years ago or 150 years ago, and it sometimes was offensive in its own way, but it was a much more kind of romantic, positive vision of Islam and Islamic lands, and so I became really interested in the Prophet Noble Drew Ali. And I was trying to answer the question of who he was, and so that led into my second book, which is called The Princess and the Prophet.
Okay. Hey, let me ask you a curious question. I'm here browsing through chapter 8, who is Walter Brister? Can you explain? Is
Mhm.
that Noble Drew Ali?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I started researching the Prophet Noble Drew Ali, all the books that have been written about him, whether by followers of the Moorish Science Temple or outside scholars, they would say that Drew Ali was born in North Carolina. And that was the story that he had told. Some researchers, one of whom was a grad student, Fathi Abid, and another of whom was an independent researcher named Patrick Bowen, they had been able to track Drew Ali to a family in Virginia. His father was James Drew. But there was very little known. So whether he was from North Carolina or Virginia, there's very little documentation about who he was. There was one notice after he passed away that said that he had been in a circus when he decided to start a Muslim order of his own. So on the basis of that alone, I mean, I knew that there were a lot of Moors and Moorish acrobats in circuses, and that the circus had a long-standing kind of fascination with Islam in general and with the Moors specifically. So it kind of made sense to me that there was some truth to this story. So based on that, I started going to circus archives, and the first one I went to was in Baraboo, Wisconsin. And in Baraboo, Wisconsin, I started looking through the route books. That is the records, kind of like a yearbook of the circus that was produced mostly for the people that worked in the circus itself. And these are really wonderful books. They're now many of them have been scanned, and they're on the website of Illinois State University. But I was going through these route books, and I found a picture of a young African-American man wearing a turban and Indian clothing. And he was the right age to be the person who turned into the Prophet Noble Drew Ali. His name was Walter Brister, and he performed under the name Sotanki with his wife named Eva Brister, who called herself Princess Sotanki. So there was, circumstantial evidence to say that this might have been the same person. And then I started finding other clues. For example, when I did research into the Bristers in, looking at historical newspapers like the Baltimore Afro-American, the Indianapolis Freeman, the Chicago Defender, you find these circus people and showmen, entertainers sending messages to each other through these papers. And in one of these messages, George Barrett, who was a member of the Fisk Jubilee Singers originally, before going into a life and show business, he sent a notice to Princess Sotanki saying, "Say hello to Drew. He's got to check out this Hindu fakir, the Hindu juggler show," which was the name for fakir or magician. So Barrett was saying to Sotanki, "Say hello to Drew," and this is Sotanki is Eva Brister. So that was one thing. Another clue was that the woman sitting next to the Prophet Noble Drew Ali in the most famous photograph of the Moorish Science Temple in 1928, there's a woman sitting right next to the Prophet. And that woman, it's obvious, it's very clear that that woman is Eva Brister. I was able to, match their photos. And I have this, you can see this on my website, which is princessandprophet.com. You can match these and they match exactly. So Eva Brister becomes Princess Sotanki, and then she's seated right next to the Prophet in 1928. But what kind of sealed the identification for me of Prophet Noble Drew Ali starting out as Walter Brister is the fact that when you look at the two photographs of Walter Brister from 1900 from the circus, and then the Prophet Noble Drew Ali from the 1920s, they both have a mole on the right side of the nose in the same exact spot. So that was enough for me, at least, to say this is the same person. And then we can talk more about what that means. I can tell you more about the life of Walter Brister as well. He was a really extraordinary individual. He was actually the very first Black star on Broadway in 1893 when he was 14 years old. He was such a big star that they actually made a bronze statue out of him. So, I don't think, some people were offended by the idea that the prophet had been in the circus, but you have to understand that the circus, it was like the NBA combined with Broadway, all in one. They were traveling with arenas in these tented temporary arenas that could seat like 15,000 people. And they would go to every, not just the big cities, but to the small cities and villages. And it was really the biggest form of entertainment that was in America at the time. So to be a star in the circus was not at all a derogatory thing. That would be like being a star on Broadway or being a star in the NBA. So now we go to look at giants playing in the NBA. Back then they looked at giants, in the circus. They had 7-footers and 8-footers in the circus. So there, you have to think about this as being really central to entertainment. He ages out of being on Broadway because he was playing it was supposed to be a child. So by the time he's 18, he kind of ages out of that. And that's when he moves into being performing as Arma Sotenki. And his performance was explicitly religious. In his very first performance, he said that he was performing according to the principles of theosophy. And theosophy was a form of, it was a Western form of Hinduism, basically, of Indian religion. So he had this interest in India and in Eastern religions from a very early point in his career.
Okay. What got him into Islam? Was it?
Well, I don't know exactly, but he was traveling with Moorish acrobats who were named the Ali brothers. And there was a white acrobat who performed with him who was also called Ali. They gave him the name Ali kind of as an honorific. Ali is a Shiite name. There's a number of Shiites, in Morocco. So, when he was traveling with this particular, it was actually the Pawnee Bill Wild West show, and then he was later in a circus. But with the Pawnee Bill Wild West show, he would have lived with these Muslim Moorish acrobats, and he would have had the opportunity to have long conversations about the Quran, about the Hadiths, about the process of the halal eating, and we know that the managers of these circuses and Wild West shows who wanted to hire Moroccan acrobats had to actually sign agreements with the Moroccan government that said that they would provide for that they would be able to practice their faith in the U.S. So we know that these acrobats included people who were devout Muslims who were practicing Islam. So that would have been one source. But another thing that came out in my research is that Islam had started to be seen by many Black people, including West Indians and African Americans and Black people in Europe as well. Islam was coming to be seen as an appropriate, or perhaps even the most appropriate faith for African descended people. And a lot of that was because of the publication of a book by Edward Wilmot Blyden, called oh, now I'm blanking on it, but it's Africa, the Negro, Islam, and the Negro. Wow, and the Negro race has Islam and Negro race in it. I'm blanking on the exact title, but this book by Blyden, who was West Indian, and then moved eventually to Liberia and for a time to Sierra Leone. He was really fascinated by Islam in Africa, and he saw, Islam was expanding in the period of European colonization because it was, in part, because it was resistant towards colonization. And you can find examples of this view of Islam in Garvey's Negro World as well. The idea that Islam was this faith that was challenging European colonialism, and that might be kind of a vector for or a vehicle for Black liberation, not only in Africa, but also kind of for spiritual self regeneration. And so there was growing interest in Islam in the early 20th century. And then there were also other groups like the Ahmadis, the Ahmadi Muslims from at the time what was India. They later on would be displaced with other Muslims to Pakistan. But the Ahmadis were sending missionaries around the world at this point. When they got to the US, they tried to convert white people to Islam and found it very difficult to do so. But they found a much more receptive audience among African Americans. And being good Muslims, they were not racist, and every soul had the same value to them. So they proceeded to kind of missionize, to evangelize among African Americans. So there were a number of factors that made Islam appear to be, in the opinion of a number of African Americans, appear to be not just a kind of a faith for personal transformation, but a faith that also promised kind of the world transformation and anti-imperialism.
Okay. I noticed also in chapter 8, you talked about how Noble Drew Ali actually faked his death.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah. So Noble Drew Ali, so Walter Brister dies officially. He dies in I think 1912 or 1913, right before Noble Drew Ali started his first chapter in Newark, his first lodge. So there was indeed a death certificate I was able to find for Walter Brister. And it was signed by the head of the cemetery and an inspector for the county. So somebody was buried as Walter Brister, but it wasn't Walter Brister because he reappears as Noble Drew Ali, and he has the mole in the same place. So the other thing is that Noble Drew Ali begins his activities in Newark using his Walter Brister's brother's name, which is Thomas Drew. Thomas Drew and Walter Brister both had a mother named Lucy. Lucy and the senior John Walter Brister, this is Walter Brister's father, I'm sorry, John Henry Brister, was married to Lucy Brister. They split up in the 1890s, and then Lucy marries James Drew, and she brings with her into the marriage a son who takes the name Thomas Drew. So most likely that is Walter Brister's brother. So we can't say exactly who was buried as Walter Brister, but we know it wasn't the original Walter Brister. And this death happens and the burial happens immediately before Noble Drew Ali starts living the life of Thomas Drew. in Newark in 1913.
So at 1913, he's now known as Timothy Drew. Am I correct? Or 1914?
1913.
1913.
Yeah.
All right. Did he start the Moorish Science Temple that year, or was it
I'm not sure if it was Timothy or Thomas. I have to look it up.
Okay.
What does it say in my book?
Hold on, take a look right
I
here.
grab the book. Well, here's the book. Yeah. So I'm sorry, what was your question? Was that the beginning of the Moorish Science Temple? No, that was called the Canaanite Temple.
Okay.
And this begins his period of exploration of Islam, and also his period when he is doing curing and healing using roots. And he's also in this era. So, this is the years immediately before and somewhat during the period known as the Harlem Renaissance. He's active in New Jersey and New York, and then he's arrested at least twice for practicing medicine without a license, which was a very common thing for Afro-descended religious practitioners and healers, because they were claiming to be able to cure people. And there were laws against practicing medicine without a license. So they got busted a lot. And Thomas or Timothy Drew got busted at least twice in Harlem. So when he moves, so then he begins to organize the Moorish Science Temple. The story is almost always told that he organizes that for the first time in Chicago in 1925. But there was a black detective agency led by a gentleman named Broussard, who claimed that the Moorish Science Temple actually began, that the Prophet Drew Lee actually began organizing on the East Coast before he got to Chicago. But be that as it may, when he went to Chicago, he was remarkably successful, remarkably quickly, not just in gathering members, but gathering some of the most prominent African Americans in the city of Chicago. So he really displayed this kind of political savvy, that he knew the way the system worked. Chicago at this time was ruled by a political machine that was allied with the infamous Al Capone. The police were on the take. Bribery kind of ran the show, and everybody was getting a kick. All the politicians were getting kickbacks from the gambling, prostitution, and other kind of vice activities, nightclubs, nightlife. The politicians were lining their pockets. And so Drew Lee was able to to understand the way the system worked and to work the system and to gain a lot of followers, thousands of followers very quickly. And he also offered, it wasn't simply religious, it was social activities, political clubs, political activities. He was able to actually gain support from many of Chicago's Black politicians, because he was able to deliver votes. So he became a political figure, not just a religious figure in Chicago in the 1920s.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right, so I don't want to go too deep in the Moorish Science Temple, but as far as the history is concerned, he did a lot of beautiful things on the ground. I got to give the Moorish Science Temple a lot of credit for that, whether it's storefronts, whether it's stores, whether it's businesses, helping politicians, doing some positive things. There's also a mystery about how he actually died. How did he actually die?
Well, this is something that my book uncovered, was the political contest and the contestation that happened around 1928 and 1929. So he passes away in summer 1929. But what preceded that was there was a power struggle going on in you could say not just the Black community, but the Chicago political community. And that power struggle was over two rival machines. There was the Thompson machine, the Thompson less Small. Small was the governor. Thompson was the mayor. So they had an alliance, and they were corrupt. They were as corrupt as the day is long. Thompson basically came out of the gambling community. He came out of the Sportsman's Club of Chicago, and he was elected for the first time. I believe it was maybe 1916. Then he was out of office, and this Democratic reformer named Charles Deaver comes in 1923. And then in 1928, he's running again. And he has the support of Al Capone, both in terms of money from Capone and Capone's organization. It's not just about Capone. It's the kind of organized crime syndicate of Chicago. So they backed Thompson with thousands of dollars, but also with muscle, with thugs that would line up votes and make sure that people voted for the Thompson machine. But behind the scenes of the Thompson machine, aside from Al Capone, who was infamous in his day as in ours, there was a man who kind of lurked in the shadows, and he was actually the wealthiest and really most powerful man in Chicago, who liked to keep to himself. And so he's not in very many history books, but his name was Samuel Insull, Insull. He was English. He wasn't Jewish, even though he had the name Samuel. He was English, and he helped to found General Electric. He was a personal secretary to Thomas Edison before he becomes vice president of this new company, General Electric. And then he moves to Chicago in 1893 after the Chicago World's Fair and takes over a company called Commonwealth Edison, which he builds into the biggest electric company in Chicago. He also then builds or takes over electric companies in all the Chicago suburbs, a lot of the Midwest, and a lot of the Southeast. So he controlled companies that were worth billions of dollars. He was on the board of, I believe, 85 companies. He was a chairman of many more. So he was the most powerful businessman in America in the 1920s. He was more powerful than Henry Ford, for example, but he liked to keep a really low profile. And his game was that he was using Chicago politicians and politicians in the state of Illinois in general to gain favorable policies for his companies. So he owned Commonwealth Edison, but he also owned the gas company that was called People's Gas. He owned the elevated railroads, the L trains. He also owned the surface transportation, the bus system as well. These were called public utilities, but they were privately owned. And so Insull was funneling money, and this is something that my book kind of uncovered for the first time since journalists wrote about it in 1930. But I was able to document that Insull was funneling money into the pockets of Oscar DePriest, who was an alderman for Chicago, who is an African-American, and Louis B. Anderson, another African-American alderman. He was giving money to DePriest so that DePriest could bribe influencers of the day, whether those were barbers or ministers or whomever, who could get Black voters to vote for the Thompson candidates. And the Thompson candidates would then in turn attempt to pass policies like higher rates on streetcars. And so this was the major kind of dynamic of Chicago politics in the 1920s was kind of Insull behind the scene, trying to were funneling bribes into the South Side, into the African American section of town, and supporting the political machine of Oscar de Priest on the South Side. So what happens in 1928 is that there's a revolt against the Thompson machine because it's so corrupt. And the revolt is led by Charles Deanan. And on the election in April of 1928, there's an African-American candidate named Oliver Granati who is running against the Thompson candidate. And Capone's thugs spot him on election day. Well, first of all, the election was marked by a lot of violence, a lot of bombing of Charles Denan's home and other homes of people who were challenging the Thompson machine. They had hand grenades thrown at the front door, other explosive devices, bombs. And then on election day itself, Al Capone's thugs spotted Oliver Granati, took place in a high-speed chase in broad daylight, and then gunned him down, murdered him. And this is a candidate for office. And this was so outrageous that there was, first of all, that the anti-Thompson candidate for Attorney General of Illinois actually wins, and then opens an investigation into the corruption of the Thompson machine. And as part of that, he actually indicts Oscar de Priest, the black alderman, who is at this point appointed to fill an empty congressional seat in Chicago. And so in the famous photograph, or there's a series of famous photographs of the convention of the Moorish Science Temple in October of 1928, at that point, Oscar de Priest is running for this congressional seat, but he's actually under indictment. And so this is kind of the background of what happens then in, I believe it was January or February of 1929, when one of the prophet's rivals and the business manager for the Moorish Science Temple, named Claude Green, is actually gunned down by an assassination squad in the headquarters of the Moorish Science Temple, which is called Unity Hall. And this hall secretly, well, not so secretly, was also the headquarters of the de Priest political machine, the People's Movement. But secretly, it had actually been purchased by Samuel Insull. So Insull was the power behind de Priest, who actually purchased Unity Hall. So when this assassination happens, the police go to the prophet's home and find a celebratory feast going on with members of the assassination crew. At this point, then, this really disturbs Thompson and Insull and the other members of the machine, because de Priest at this point now is elected to fill the congressional seat, but it remains to be seen whether he will actually be seated. And there's precedent for this because another Insull candidate for Senate was elected but not seated, because Samuel Insull had given so much money that they said they didn't know if the candidate was the senator from Illinois or the senator from Insull. So there was precedent for the Congress not seating a politician who had actually won political office. So when this assassination happens in Unity Hall, it threatened to expose the kind of behind the scene workings of Insull and the Thompson machine and their linkages through bribery with Oscar de Priest. And it was this assassination that also then turns the Chicago Defender and Jesse Binga of Binga Bank against the prophet. And he he falls ill, and he dies officially of pneumonia. The doctor who signed his death certificate was the brother was part of the Thompson machine, and he worked at Provident Hospital in the pneumonia ward. So he would have had access to pneumonia. And then after the death of the prophet in 1929, a year later in 1930, Samuel Insull writes a check for $2 million to Provident Hospital. So there's it looks highly suspicious. We can't really prove that that's exactly what happened or that that's why the prophet died, but it really smells that it was unnatural causes that the prophet was actually killed.
Sound like a movie script.
Doesn't it? Yeah. Whenever I describe my book, people say that should be a movie.
Yeah. All right. So I'm done with the Moorish science simple. I think you've spoken about it a lot, and if I don't want to go too deep, but I just thought the Walter Bristol conversation was pretty good. That's why I wanted to go there, and I found it fascinating reading your book learning about that for the first time. Just reading your book. All right, let's move on to the origins. Where do you think the Hebrew Israelite movement started? Where would you say it started?
Well, there's kind of a dispute whether it starts with Bishop William Christian in 1891, or with William Saunders Crowdy in 1892, I believe. And then there's a gentleman named Frank Cherry who said, he started it in the 1880s. I don't think Cherry is very credible because, for one thing, he was using the uniforms and of the William Saunders Crowdy's organization. But the earliest kind of identification with the Hebrew Israelites comes in enslaved people's religious identification with the story of the Hebrew Israelites and the Exodus and the liberation from slavery, which slave owners tried to keep and hide from enslaved people because they didn't want to,
All right, let me stop for 1 second. Let me pause for 1 second here. So we're back, and we had a little bit of technical difficulties, but go ahead, my brother.
Okay, so there was a long history of identification between African American enslaved people, African American people in general, and the Hebrew Israelites, and the story of both their suffering and slavery in Egypt, and then their liberation through the Exodus. So that became, that was a story that gave hope to many enslaved people. And then there was a kind of identification with the Israelites, both during and after slavery. In the 1870s, there was a movement from Louisiana and Mississippi, mostly, to the state of Kansas. Those people were called exodusters. From Kansas, then, Black people were among the settlers that moved into Oklahoma. There was a town called Guthrie, Oklahoma. There still is. And outside of Guthrie, there was a town that was named for John Mercer Langston called Langston, Oklahoma. And that's where William Saunders Crowdy moves in 1891. And that's where he starts having religious visions. I think that Crowdy is the most significant and probably the earliest of the Black Hebrew Israelite bishops and organizers. There's also a claim to be made that William Christian was the first. He began a few years before Crowdy. But Crowdy built a national church called the Church of God and Saints of Christ. And William Christian built a church as well, but it wasn't nearly as big. Then there was a man named Frank Cherry who turns up in Philadelphia, who claimed that he was the first. But I really don't think that's very credible, because Cherry was actually using the uniforms and the costumes of the Crowdy Church, Church of God and Saints of Christ. There's also a figure who called himself Rabbi Richelieu, who claimed to be first, but I think he's kind of a mythical figure. William Saunders Crowdy, though, definitely lived, and he spread his teachings. And it was kind of, you could think about it as reverse engineering Judaism from the Hebrew Bible.
Pause for 1 second. Pause for one second. Why you say Richelieu is like a fictional figure? Why you made that statement?
Why? Because I haven't seen any evidence, he's
a real guy.
Yeah, other than
was it Josiah Ford or Wentworth, or one of them, I think, used to go to his organization or something like that? They claim that
he was associated, according to the press, Richelieu was the founder of the Moorish Zionist temple.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why I find that a little hard to believe is that the Moorish Zionist temple was obviously a version of, a version of the name of the Moorish Science Temple, mm-hmm. which isn't active until the 1920s and is officially organized in 1925. So I just don't think there would have been a Moorish Zionist temple 20 years prior to that.
Okay.
And the only notice of Richelieu comes from, Rabbi Mordechai Herman of the Moorish Zionist Temple, saying that that's where the Moorish Zionist Temple came from. But it's hard to believe that there was a Moorish Zionist Temple before the Moorish Science Temple, because we only have press reports of it after the Moorish Science Temple. So that's why I find that Richelieu, there's no evidence of him other than Mordecai Herman saying that he was the guy who founded.
Isn't Mordecai Herman attached to Faitlovich with the whole Ethiopian connection?
No, Faitlovich really has almost no connection to these groups, other than he visited with Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthew, because Matthew was calling himself a Falasha, which is the name for the Beit Yisrael, the Ethiopian Israelites. So Faitlovich was involved with the Ethiopian Jews, who were then known as Falasha. So when he visited New York, people said, you have to go visit the Ethiopian Hebrews in Harlem. And he did. And he decided that there was no connection with Ethiopia, which turns out to be the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So with the Richelieu thing, it's kind of shaky. We're not too sure about it. But then after, you have Crowdy, you have William Christian, mm-hmm. you have Frank Cherry. Frank moves to Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of stuff going on over there also, as far as the Quakers and all that stuff in the 1800s anyway. So there's a strong connection.
And Crowdy too. Crowdy's headquarters moves from Kansas. He organizes the church in Lawrence, Kansas in the 1890s. He goes to Chicago. By 1898, his followers are being called Black Jews, mm-hmm. and they're teaching about forbidden meats and practicing the seventh-day Sabbath and foot washing, which is an Old Testament practice.
I think he had a 2000 prophecy too. The year 2000 prophecy. I think he was probably the originator of that talk per se. He's probably one of the first few people to say that from the African American community. Yeah, it was passed on for years and years in 2000, because if you know the One West group, they were predicting that 2000 something would happen too. Yeah. So let me get this now. Let's see if we could do a little chronology here.
Yeah.
You have Crowdy, Christian, Cherry. I'm going to loop them together, although you said pretty much Crowdy was like the main guy who had the biggest organization wide.
Mm-hmm.
So they're all here in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And then after them, what would be like a byproduct of those three movements? Would you say, because I know in Virginia, I think is it Cherry's group that's still, or Crowdy, one of their.
Yeah, that's Crowdy's group. Yeah, the Church of God and Saints of Christ. So Crowdy puts his headquarters become Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
And then from Philadelphia, he moves down to the Tidewater of Virginia, to Suffolk, Virginia, which is very close to Southern Maryland, which is where he was born.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then another interesting point is that Crowdy, he meets a young South African who comes to Philadelphia, had a vision, finds Crowdy, and then brings the Church of God and Saints of Christ to South Africa, and helps and starts to influence Israelite groups in South Africa. So that's a very interesting. This is a transnational movement that goes back to Africa. So that's kind of the first generation, the generation of the 1890s into the early 20th century. Then there's a second generation, and so the first generation is coming out of the Holiness Church movement and the Masonic organizations.
Yeah, Freemason.
Yeah, so all of these people were Freemasons. And Freemasonry also passed along stories about Hiram, the builder of King Solomon's temple, and so a lot of their legends are very much connected to the ancient Israelites.
Right.
So they form the first generation. That's kind of the holiness movement generation. Then after World War I, during the era of the Great Migration, you have a second generation of leaders and movements. Many of these people were West Indians, like Wentworth Arthur Matthew and Arnold Josiah Ford. And they move to Harlem, and they start their own movements. Mordecai Herman is another member of this generation who was probably from Virginia. Many of these men were involved in the Marcus Garvey UNIA movement, and they met each other in Liberty Hall, the headquarters of the movement in New York. Arnold Josiah Ford was a musician originally from Barbados, who composed the Universal Negro Improvement Association's hymn, and wrote other songs, composed a hymn book, and led the choir for the UNIA. In the UNIA, he meets Mordecai Herman and helps to found the Moorish Zionist Temple, and then also the BBA, the Beth B'nai Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
And then he founds a club, a pioneers club, to establish what they called a colony in Ethiopia. And after the coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie, he actually, in 1930, Ford actually moves to Ethiopia with a number of followers, supported by several hundred subscribers to his Ari Noth Club, the Pioneer Club. And it's in Ethiopia that he sends back a certificate of ordination to Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthew. So the things that are notable about the second generation is that they start to practice Judaism. They have Torahs, they have prayer books, which are usually Sephardic prayer books. They start to wear prayer shawls, and they start to wear kippot. And they start to practice Jewish holidays like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and so forth. So they're practicing Judaism in a way that's different than the first generation that was practicing Hebraic practices that they found out about through the Hebrew Bible, but they weren't really doing Judaic practices. That is the practice of Judaism that was formulated after the Babylonian period of exile through the teachings of the Talmud, not just the Torah. So the second generation, the biggest figure Ford dies in 1935 when the Italians invade Ethiopia. He leaves 2 sons, however, both of them whom eventually returned to the U.S. And he also left. He had a daughter as well. I was fortunate enough to meet his sons and his daughter. And then Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthew founds what he calls the Ethiopian Hebrew Commandment Keepers Congregation. Matthew's connection to Ethiopia was, he said, that his father had been a Ethiopian falasha cantor who then moved to West Africa. Problem with that is that the Ethiopian Hebrews didn't have a position of cantor, and there's no kind of explanation for how falasha would have gotten to Nigeria. But we know about Matthew. I was able to find out quite a bit about his background, and he belonged to a Jesus-only Pentecostal group in the islands before he came to New York, and then even after he was in New York, when he incorporated his church in 1918, it was called the Ethiopian Hebrew Commandment Keepers Church of the Living God and the Pillar and Ground of Truth and Faith in Jesus Christ. I believe that was the full title. And he kept Jesus Christ in the name until the 1960s when he reorganized. He also had a sign up in the congregation talking about Pentecost. So it seems pretty likely. He actually wrote in a letter to another clergyman that he had been a part of a Jesus-only group, which was a name for a branch of Pentecostalism. But what's really interesting, one of the things that's so interesting about him is that over the course of the 1920s and 1930s, he transitions away from Christianity towards Judaism, and goes from calling himself Bishop Matthew to Rabbi Matthew, and then eventually to Chief Rabbi of the Western Hemisphere. And he trains a lot of people, which is really his biggest impact on the movement, is that he trains so many rabbis, who some of whom stay in New York, others go to Chicago, in the Midwest. And he also has contact with rabbis from William Saunders Crowdy's Church of God and Saints of Christ. So he's starting to build, each kind of successive generation of Israelite movements incorporates some of the ideas and the members and the training of previous movements. And so we can see that between the first generation, the holiness generation, and then the second generation, kind of the Harlem Judaic generation of Rabbi Matthew.
Beautiful. So now what's the next stage? So we still have the Crowdy groups in Virginia, and we still have we don't have too much of the Christian group, William Christian groups. They don't sit them around. And what about Frank Cherry?
That's a good question. I'm honestly not sure what happens to Frank Cherry. I know where to look for that. That would be James Landing's book, Black Judaism, which is kind of like an encyclopedia.
Yeah, I actually have it. Is it right here? Somewhere right here.
Yeah.
But all right. So we have out of Wentworth, you now have this guy named Abba Bivens. All right. Now, was Abba Bivens ever a part of Crowdy's group? Because I heard some rumor about him being a part of some group before he met Wentworth.
I've never heard that. Yeah. It could be, but the Bivens family was a very prominent family in the Harlem branch of the Commandment Keepers congregation. Okay. And so Abba Bivens founds One West, as you know. And so he's really the founder of he's part of the third wave of movements that start in the 50s and 60s. and he's really kind of the founder of not just the third wave movements, but kind of the fourth wave movements. The fourth wave is kind of the internet generation of
Right.
Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
But the third wave was, you can think of them as kind of more Black nationalist, and they move just like the second wave was moving towards Judaism. The third wave is moving away from Judaism into Israelitism. They reject the
Awesome.
name
Yes.
of Jews and adopt the name of Israelite. And it's really important to note that to be an Israelite doesn't mean to practice any specific religion. Most of the Israelites today, or people who would call themselves Black Hebrew Israelites today, are also Christians, right? They believe in Christianity. So you have, but you could say the same about many Black Muslims, because, you know, Israelitism came on the scene before Black Muslims, and they incorporated many of its historical teaching. And the essential teaching, of course, is that the ancient Israelites were Black, and that Black people today are the descendants of those Israelites. So you can believe that and practice any number of religions, and still be an Israelite. So the third wave movements of the 50s and 60s were much more concerned with Israelitism rather than Judaism, and many of them didn't call themselves Jews anymore. They called themselves Israelites. And it's kind of also a generational thing. It's like, just like the young people of the late 1960s start to adopt not just the Black Power movement, but the Black arts movement, the Black is beautiful movement. They claim the name Black, as opposed, you know, their parents called themselves Negroes or colored people. And the younger generation says, no, we're going to call ourselves Black. That's a generational shift that happens in the 60s. And you have this very similar generational shift among Black Jews, the children of whom start calling themselves Black Hebrews or Black Hebrew Israelites or Black Israelites, or later just simply Israelites.
You know, I find it very interesting, right? So you have Abba Bivens, and Abba Bivens is well connected to Ethiopia. For some reason, I think his family or his children are connected to Ethiopia. But after Abba Bivens, now you have what's called the development of One West.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we're looking at the early 70s, right out around 73, between 73 78, this development of these guys. What goes on with them as far as their development?
Well, this is the one area of Black Hebrew Israelite history that I haven't written about. I plan to write about someday. So it's the area that I know the least about. But one of the real innovations of the One West groups, and Bivens created a manifesto, and one of his real innovations was saying that basically all people of color, whether they be Puerto Rican or Mexican or African American or West Indian, all belong to different tribes of the different Israelite tribes. And so at this point, the Israelite movement, which until this point was, it had a very few white members in Crowdy's organization, but it was basically an African American movement. Now with the One West groups, it starts to broaden and expand. And then it also innovates a whole different style, right? The kind of confrontational street preaching style of there's many groups of Israelites who've become famous for, you know, haranguing passerbys on in Times Square or Harlem, and sometimes Venice Beach, other parts, other cities around the country. They also innovate what they call a camp style, which is a style of clothing It's supposed to resemble the ancient Israelites, kind of like tunics and head wraps, and a kind of a very confrontational style. They also have been confronting Christian ministers with their version of ancient history and Hebraic history. So it's these movements, the One West movements, and there's, they rapidly kind of splinter and different schisms happen and different leaders emerge. It's these movements that both use street preaching, but then when the internet becomes more popular, they move onto the internet. And if you look around you on YouTube, you can find many examples of One West style Hebrew Israelites. So they've become an internet phenomenon. And so now you can subscribe to Israelite beliefs. You can learn about Israelite beliefs and history without, ever setting foot inside of a church or a synagogue or a temple. And so we're really seeing a whole fourth wave. And that's also, it's gained the attention of a number of celebrities, that Kyrie, Kanye, and Kendrick Lamar, 3Ks, have all subscribed or
said something positive regarding.
Said something positive. It's not like a subscription, but they have repeated Black Israelite beliefs, and then that's gained the movement, fame and exposure, and a lot of press reports. So, Kendrick Lamar is rapping about being an Israelite in his music. He was brought into the movement by his cousin, I believe, in Florida. So it's no longer the question of, does Kendrick Lamar belong, or is he a member? It's more that he is spreading the ideas and the beliefs of Black Israelite ideology and history and identity.
Okay. That's beautiful, man. Beautiful. We actually went over an hour, which I was hoping we'd stop before, but we did pretty good. I want to say I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience have learned a lot. And when you decide to do the book about One West and the internal stuff, there's some people I could definitely connect you with as far as the history and so forth.
Great.
Moving forward, other than working on a book about the One West, what else are you planning to work on? As far as if you're going to do any more books, because I know you're career, teaching and all that stuff. So, what do you plan to work on in the future?
Well, I have a project. Originally I was going to, not originally, but at one phase of the development of my books, I was writing them together because I thought that what they're really about, or what they're variations of, are ideas about the East and the Orient, what we are sometimes call Orientalism. The idea that the East, the Orient, Palestine is the center of three major faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so the idea that, being involved in the East, how should I say this? The idea that the East and the Orient contains religious wisdom that is unique to the East and the Orient, and that it provides a path towards liberation. And you can see that among Rastafarians. Buju Banton is always talking about the East. He said the East is the best.
Mm-hmm.
There's no living in the West. And Blyden talked about the East and about the Orient. There's this long tradition of this idea of the East and of the Orient as a kind of font of liberation, and it's adopted by African descended peoples, whether those be West Indians or African Americans, or in some cases West Indians who moved to London, like Duzay Muhammad Ali, who I was able to show in an article last year, I published last year, was most likely West Indian. He was named William Rand. So my next book is about Black Orientalism, about the uses of the idea of the East in African and American and Black more generally, kind of religion, political philosophy. And I think that it's, when Martin Luther King adopts Gandhi, he's turning to the East. When Malcolm X adopts Islam, he's also turning to the East. So there's the sense that, there was a whole Black movement in Chicago called the East. There's this through line about the East as a source, not just of religious, but of political liberation. So my next book is going to be investigating that idea.
All right. I want to say to you, I'm very impressed with your knowledge of the Moorish Science Temple and the Black Hebrew Israelites. And continue teaching, man. You did a good, beautiful job today. All right. I'm going to end the interview on that note. Peace and love to you.
Okay. Peace and love.